So ladies, I have another message for you today. This has been a really difficult one for me to put together. I've had countless titles for this message that I've scrubbed, and I've just settled on surrender. And I take this almost entirely from 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 7 through 9. And this, of course, is the Apostle Paul, the same guy that God had raised the dead through and healed through on countless occasions. And apparently, he talks about a time in his life where he had this thorn in the flesh. And we don't really know what this thorn was. I mean, he doesn't tell us what it was. All we know is that it bothered him to such a great extent that he prayed to God 3 times to take it away from him. And God's ultimate response to him was, no, I'm not going to take this thorn from you. My grace is sufficient for you. Now we know why in this instance why God wouldn't, because Paul tells us. He said that because of the exceedingly great visions that God had given him, namely obviously being taken up into heaven, that God gave him this thorn or allowed this situation into his life to keep him humble. Obviously, God knew Paul better than Paul knew Paul, and he knew that Paul would have a problem with pride and arrogance. And so he allows this circumstance into his life so that Paul might remain obviously humble, and as a result, I'm adding to this, be dependent on the Lord. And I guess why I say all this is because this mirrors to some degree numerous instances in my own life where I have prayed to God for something and he hasn't granted it. And I've believed, I've had other people pray, I've quoted the scriptures, and yet at the same time, God has not seen fit to grant that request. And in some instances, it's been disappointing. In other instances, it's been devastating. But I think that I'm beginning to learn, and I may never learn this entirely while I live, but I'm beginning to learn that God doesn't always give us what we want, but he will definitely give us what we need. And there's a difference between the two. You read James chapter 4, verse 3, and it says what? You ask, but you do not receive. Why? Because you ask with the wrong motives, so that you may get and then spend it on yourself. And I think that Paul was asking in a very similar fashion to James chapter 4, verse 3. He was asking with his own sinful motives in mind. And I think God loved Paul so much that he wasn't going to give Paul what he wanted, because that probably would have destroyed him. And I have to trust, as maybe both of you will later on in your lives, that there will be certain things that God doesn't give you, and it may break your heart, but it is ultimately because he has a higher way for you. He doesn't give you what you want, because that might destroy you, but he gives you ultimately what you need. And so I guess through all of this, right, we learn more and more something I think that is really difficult for the whole human race, which is the title of my message. It's to surrender, to give it more to the Lord, that it's not us. It's not based on us. It's based on him. And let me just finish up this message with this. And I may have quoted this earlier, but I think I'll give this a better treatment. I may have quoted this in an earlier message. But Fleetwood Mac, Fleetwood Mac, yes, the rock group, I know I'm being crass here, came out with what I consider to be probably one of their finest albums. It was 1977, and it was called Rumors. And they had one lyric from that album, which just blew me away. It was, rulers make bad lovers, you better put your kingdom up for sale. And that is absolutely true, not only with the people around you, right, but with God as well. Whenever you try and control somebody, the one thing you stop doing is loving them. You can't love people. You can't appreciate people who at the same time you're trying to control. And I think it is when we surrender that rule, that control, and recognize that God's sovereign, that he's in control, that the relationship with him really begins. God bless you both.